Welcome back, you beautiful sons of bitches, to Uncle Grim, where I read things and I paint things. If you want to know what happens to Lieutenant Castamon, stay tuned to all the videos. But right now, we're getting into Chapter 3. We'll be painting the Deathleaper. I already kind of held it up. Now let's take a little bit closer. Part of my Tyranid army. The reason being is Leviathan is the book written by Darius Hinks, published by Black Library. So I like Tyranids, and I figured what better book to read while I paint my Tyranid army than Leviathan. So yeah, stay tuned to find out what happens next. Chapter 3. Command Deck of the Incorruptible Regium System. Segmentum Pacificus. Lieutenant Tyrus. The voice rang across the bridge. We have word from the Crassus orbital relay. The bridge of the Incorruptible is shaped like a sword, or the nave of a cathedral, with Tyrus command dais positioned at the intersection. He looked up from a crescent display of screens, his face bathed in flickering light. His skin was an angry mess of bioacid scars, and this, combined with the harsh green light, transformed his face into a grotesque mask. Did you receive the coordinates? There was a dozen people on the bridge, a mixture of human deck officers and ratings, red-robed tech adepts, and armor-clad ultramarines from a mixture of companies. They fell silent, looking up at the emitter that had relayed the message. The emitter was embedded with a chest of a glabrous, feudal-looking cherub whirring above the command dais. Negative, Lieutenant. It's hard to explain. The voice was little more than a screech of static, but even though the interference, Tyrus could tell there was something wrong. The fetal messenger grimaced, thrashing its stumping wings. Try anyway. Look in all directions. Deep void auger scans. Make haste, my lord. The signal died, taking the static howl with it, and the cherub fluttered its absurd wings, swaying off into the shadows. A deck officer approached. My lord, she said, looking up at him. What are your orders? Tyrus shook his head, resuming his pacing. The Xenos have been heading directly for Crassus. Since they entered the system, and the larger bioforms are as vast as battle cruisers, even with all this disturbance, there should be sign of them by now. He looked at the Oculus again, frowning at the tumult outside, thinking back over his previous encounters with the Tyranids. My lord, screeched the cherub, fluttering from the shadows. You are correct. We have located the Xenos. They are heading away from the biomass source. That was why we missed it in our first pass. Tyrus looked over at Voltus. Then this is a trap. They are coming for this. We need to. No, my lord, begging your pardon. They are not headed towards our ships. They could have masked their approach with empiric disturbance they've created, but they chose not to. They bypassed us. They're heading in system. They're heading for Regium. Regium! He looked at Voltus. What is this? We have been deceived. Something boomed in the distance and the command deck went dark. A moment later, emergency lumens blinked into life, bathing the chamber in fitful light. Warning klaxons brayed across the bridge. Lieutenants! Said one of the deck officers, looking up from his display screen, his voice taut. Starboard void shields just died. The generators are failed, and the portside generators are struggling to cope. Starboard weapon batteries are offline, said another officer, peering at his display. The plasma drives have stopped responding, said another, staring at Tyrus, her face pale. We have no power. Kill the port-side generators before they overload, said Tyrus, snatching his helmet from the stand beside the command throne. He locked the helmet into place as he strode across the bridge, heading for the exit. Warning signals blinked across his helm display. He opened a Vox channel. Boarding action. Single point of entry. Void shield compromised. He shook his head. Whatever it is moving fast. We are breached. Weapon systems and void shields are down. All available military personnel make for Akato deck. He smiled inside his helmet. Whatever games these creatures are playing, they will pay for their hubris. Our prey has just thrown itself at our feet. He sprinted out into the passageway, the Ultramarines following him. As the ship ground to a halt, with the ever-present roar of the vessel's reactors gone, there was an unusual quiet, broken only by the distant bark of klaxons and the creak of straining bulkheads. The Incorruptible was adrift. Smoke rolled down the corridors towards him. He heard the sound of more explosions in the distance. No, not explosions, he thought. It sounded more like something tearing. He studied the glyphs on his helm display. Brother Baraka, you are the closest to the gunnery deck. What do you see? White noise flooded the network, followed by distorted, incomprehensible words. Repeat, demanded Tyrus, running faster. Atmospheric controls have been... crackled the reply, followed by a jumble of overlapping, truncated voices. Ingress, lore cry, and Karastis access point, but have no... I saw something big. It was airing reclusium. It was... Brother Dometh, bring fire support to the... Making our way to the Akato, but the grav plating has been destabilized. Grav is down. Brother Baraka, how close are you? The smoke's behaving strangely like shadows. I think it was... Tyrus tried to reply, but the voices looped and overlapped until they became such a cacophony that he had to kill the channel. He changed direction, running down a different passageway, summoning schematics across his helm display, looking for a faster route at the gunnery deck. This was even smokier, but when he glanced back, he saw that his quads were still with him, calmly slamming magazines into bolt rifles and checking seals on their power armor. The Apocrypha 3 Voltus was also there, loading his Absolver bolt pistol and adjusting his diagnostic equipment. Further back, struggling to keep pace, were a crowd of voidsmen drawing weapons and fastening rebreathers across their faces, like solid shadows. Tyrus stared at the smoke and saw that it did seem odd. It was crawling across the floor, grasping like talons. He wondered if it might be a chemical attack. His suit showed no signs of warnings. But there was definitely something odd about how the darkness was rolling, coalescing. He halted before a set of armor-plated doors that refused to open. He hammered at the controls, but nothing happened. Siren! He barked, stepping back from the entrance. Behind him, one of his men raised a plasma incinerator and filled the passageway with noise and light. When the air cleared, the door was a molten heap. Shapes rushed at Tyrus. Half hidden by smoke, blinking lights, they were hunched two-legged, but even through the haze he could see they were not human. They each had 4 arms and hung low to the ground, ending in hooked talons. Their bodies were muscular and armored. They were moving incredibly fast. Hostiles! He roared, raising his pistol and taking aim. Projectiles whistled past Tyrus as he opened fire. Instantly he felt at ease. His gun was bucking in his fist, and his battle brothers were with him. Things were as they should be. There was a thunderous din as the Ultramarines opened fire, punching Xenos off their hooves and sending them scrambling backwards down the passageway. More poured from the shadows, clambering up over each other in a flurry of darkness, showing no sign of pain or fear. If he were facing another foe, Tyrus might have considered them brave. But to call Tyranids brave would be like praising a disease. Even the word foe was misleading. There was an infestation, something to be cleansed with steel and fire. Tyrus placed his shots with care, so engrossed in the combat that he was only vaguely aware of the movement behind him. Then there was an explosion of tearing metal that almost threw him off his feet. He whirled around and saw the rent in the walls as if a battle tank had careened through the ship. Embers whirled through the smoke. He was shocked to see that several Ultramarines were down, their armor split as savagely as bulkheads. The rest of the squad had backed away from the hole, weapons trained on the wreckage. "Lieutenant!" cried. Sorry to interrupt the reading of the book, guys, but I just want to say this isn't exactly the best kit I've put together. I honestly liked the older models where you could kind of articulate the limbs and that. This outer shell and that right here snapped on me, unfortunately, just because trying to put the cape in between the legs and the tail, it wasn't cast properly and it's offset and twisted, so that when I went to try and put it together, it put too much strain and stress on the spine part and snapped. So luckily glue happens, but come on, Games Workshop, cast it a little bit better or make it easier to put together. Like, they're not hard to put together, but a little bit, like, because it's 3 pieces for the leg, so you gotta kind of line it all up, but there's like an itty bitty hole because the way that the leg is set, if this damn thing will focus. But yeah, anyways, I wonder if anybody else has had this problem with this casting of the Deathleaper. Anyways, back to the story. One of his brothers, as more Tyranids flooded into view, clattering over the deck and leaping through the air. Tyrus and others opened fire, their weapons spitting rounds until there was nothing left of the Tyranids but splintered chitin. Then Tyrus headed over to the fallen brothers, appalled to see that one of them was dead. He looked up at Voltus, about to give him an order, but it was interrupted by a large tearing sound. He looked in the direction of the noise. "Did none of you see that?" Most of them shook their heads, but Voltus spoke up. "I saw a shape, a Tyranid, I think, but unusually large, unusually fast." Now that the model is built, we'll be using Vallejo colors in order to do the paint scheme. So on the rest of my Tyranid army, I use a bone kind of color and then a purple. That's the scheme that I go with for my army. For the bone colors, I use game color, Blanco Sucio. I use Panzer Aces. I think it's called Highlight British RKR. Let's get this thing to focus on the product. Oh, okay. And then I use Blanco Hueso. And then I use Light Mud. I don't know if you guys can see it. Camera might not be focusing. And then, son of a monkey's uncle. For the purples, I usually use these colors. We have Violeta Denso, Blue Violet, Purpura Hexizero, I think that's what it's called, or Hexed Lichen, and then Violeta, so straight violet, and then Violet Red. But on this model, I went out and I bought Vallejo's Express colors, so I'm going to tie those in to the main body scheme as well. And I got Rosa Crepuscula and then Rosa Fluido. And those are going to be the main body colors. So the carapace is going to be the purple, and then the limbs are going to be the bone colors. And then for accents, what I usually use is some pinks and some light purples. So I use Old Rose, Beige Red, Brown Rose, and then pastel violet, and also for really like poppy places, I use a fluorescent magenta. So yeah, those are the colors that we'll be using again. The new express colors from Vallejo. Other than that, let's watch me paint some more and get back into this chapter. Tyrus considered the layout of the ship in relation to the damaged wall. Whatever it was, it appears to be making for the gunnery deck. He clambered through the hole and into the next room, gesturing for the others to follow. The room was long and narrow mess hall. They sprinted past overturned chairs and tables, following the wreckage out into another smoke-filled passageway. The Tyranids were waiting. They flooded down the corridor, leaping through the darkness. The Ultramarines fired a storm of bolter rounds. There was far more Xenos this time, and some managed to return fire. Whatever their ammunition was, it burrowed through the power armor. Several Ultramarines fell backwards, clutching the wounds, blood spraying between their fingers. Tyrus hurled a grenade and charged into the aftermath with the others rushing after him. There was another explosion, far louder than his grenade, and Tyrus was hurled across the floor, almost losing hold of his pistol. When he looked back, he saw another gaping hole and more dead Ultramarines. "By the Emperor!" he muttered as he stood and rushed back. "What is this?" The Tyranids were still firing, but he ignored them, battling anger as he marched over to the new hole that had been ripped through the wall. "Something is toying with us, Voltus," said Voltus, looking at one of the devices fixed to his armors. "Attacking and withdrawing." Tyrus gunned down another Tyranid. It continued crawling towards him, so he whipped out his combat knife and sliced through the monster's carapace, removing its head. As he did so, some of the corpse twitched and clattered on the floor. "Is that typical?" Voltus nodded. He went over to the dead Tyranid and crouched next to it. "And there is something else unusual. Did you see what happened when you beheaded this specimen?" The others reacted. He looked closer. "And this was not the head? Look, the head is still attached. This is something else altogether." He lifted the piece of Tyranid Tyrus had cut away with both, and they both saw it was a small creature that had been attached to the larger one. It was still alive, thrashing and struggling as Voltus locked pincers around it. Then he used one of the tools on his backpack to drill through its carapace. As the drill bit and sank deeper, the surrounding corpses juddered again. Tyrus raised his pistol as he saw some of the Tyranids were trying to rise. "Wait," said Voltus, holding up the bloody drill. "Let me try that again." He pushed the drill a bit into a different part of the creature, and more of the Tyranids tried to stand. They were little more than butchered remains, but each time Voltus probed the smaller creature, they lurched to life, twitching and grasping like broken puppets. "Fascinating." Voltus tapped the data slate on his wrist. "I wonder if there is any record of this behavior happening before. Some kind of pheromonal trigger. I remember reading Brother Apocryphy," warned Tyrus. "Save your research until after we save the ship." Voltus saluted and rose to his feet, falling in with the other Ultramarines, but he kept his specimen, forcing it into one of the containment canisters on his belt. It was becoming even harder to see through the shadows, but as Tyrus looked around, he realized that there were only 5 members of his squad left with him, along with Voltus. "Keep moving," he said, running through another hole and following the trail of destruction. A few minutes later, he came to a halt. Bulkheads had been hurled into a smoldering heap, blocking the route. "This way," Tyrus said, racing up a ladder to the access hatch. He turned the wheel lock and shoved the hatch open, leaping up into the maintenance tunnel. His boots had barely landed on the deck when the ship lurched sideways. He heard the unmistakable sound of explosions tearing through the bulkheads. The tremor hurled him from his feet, and he clattered across the floor. "Lieutenant!" cried a voice from below, and Tyrus saw that the ladder was gone, along with most of the passageway. All he could see was the clinging darkness. "Voltus!" Tyrus called. "Sidon, are you there?" He heard distant, muffled replies, but he could not make out the words as they grew more and more distant by the second. He considered dropping back down, but the remnants of the floor looked like it would collapse under his weight. "Meet me at Acado deck," he ordered. Drawing his bolt pistol, as he rose to his feet, he carried on down the tunnel, engulfed in fumes. As he ran, more tremors shook in the ship. He had attempted to use the Vox network again. Brother Sestafon, send me your coordinates. Update me with when you reach the gunnery deck. Baraka, Brother Drinium, can any of you hear me? Lieutenant Tyrus, Volta's voice broke through the static. I think you are the target. I have your position on my display, brother. Dominatus is down, and Siren, but it meant to. You will see it when it led us away from you. How a predator divides a herd. It is, and now is hunting you. What is hunting me? The only reply was another howl of feedback. What is this? Demanded Tyrus. But at that moment the ship juddered again, and he almost lost his footing. He steadied himself and ran on, leaping over rents that had opened in the floor and ignoring the torrent of alerts that were scrolling down his helm display. He reached an access hatch and was about to drop down through it when another explosion rocked the maintenance tunnel. Plasteel hammered into him as he tumbled back the way he came, showered in debris. Then the whole structure gave way, and it crashed down into the room below. A balcony slowed his fall as he broke through it. Then he slammed onto the floor. More warnings scrolled down his helm display as his armor alerted him to damaged seals and buckled joints. He rolled back onto his feet, gun raised, surveyed the chamber. He was on a large rectangular observation deck, hundreds of feet long and dominated by a single leaf-shaped oculus that looked out onto the void. There was rubble scattered around him, and some of the smaller pieces were floating above the floor. Grav plating is compromised, he said, looking around the chamber. Hunting you. Volta's voice sheared through the static in his helm. Then it became garbled loop as it faded back into the din. Tyrus filled his helm display with schematics, examining the ship's layout. Looking for another approach to the gunnery deck, he spotted a route, blinked the schematics away, and strode across the chamber, checking his gun for damage as he approached one of the exits. Boom! The ship juddered again. This time, rather than a tremor, it was a single hammer blow, as if a giant had pounded the floor. Tyrus halted. The noise had come from the next chamber. Boom! Even louder this time, coming closer. Boom! The floor shook, so hard that Tyrus struggled to stay on his feet. Boom! He looked down at the chamber to the wall at the far end. Whatever was making the noise was on the other side, approaching fast. Voices bubbled up through the static. Lieutenant Tyrus! It was Voltus again. There is no, we have, you must return to the bridge. There is no way to return to the bridge. Get out of. Tyrus approached the wall, raising his gun. Boom. The sound was so close the wall trembled, splitting screws from its brackets. He stood side on and took aim at the center of the wall. Nothing happened. He stood there for several seconds, gun trained on the wall, but the tremors ceased. He wondered if he was becoming confused. Perhaps the disturbance projected by the Tyranids could confound even Adeptus Astartes' minds. He was about to lower his pistol, but then he hesitated, thinking back over his encounter with the Tyranids. Most were frenzied, but there had been a few rare occasions when they acted with more cunning. It is hunting you. Could that be true? Could Voltus be right? As he stared at the wall, he sensed something staring back from the other side, something weighing him up, considering him. I am not prey, he said, unclasping his chainsword from his belt and gunning the motor. The teeth rotated with a satisfying roar, hazing the air with promethium fumes. He sensed movement on the other side of the wall, something so heavy that the floor strained and creaked. He switched the chainsword from side to side. He heard a single breath, deep and slow. Come on, he whispered. Let me see your face. The wall exploded. Plasteel flew through the air, slamming into his armor and kicking him from his feet. He tumbled backwards, blood filling his mouth, then stood and fired, bolt rounds barking into the clouds of dust. A colossal figure stomped into view, so large it had to stoop to enter the chamber. For an absurd moment, he thought he was facing a mythical beast, something dragged from folktale. It looked like a dragon, wreathed in flames and hellish light. It was standing upright on its hind legs and enormous. An armored tail was lashing about its hooves. He recited a battle prayer to steady his thoughts, and then he saw clearly. It was not a dragon, of course. It was a tyrannid. Its purple and bone-colored carapace was instantly familiar, as was like the insect segmentation of its body, but he had never seen nor heard of a tyrannid reaching such kind of size. It took a moment for him to comprehend its scale. It was taller than an oculus. He held his fire, and the two combatants studied each other. "You were hunting me." Tyrus peered up at the tyrannid's face, surprised by how much intelligence there was in its eyes and recognition. Somehow, it knew who he was. And as the rest of its kind sped towards Regium, it had come here, alone, for him. The tyrannid shifted position, rocking the floor as it brought one of its hooves down. It looked away from Tyrus and surveyed the chamber, taking in piles of debris and broken machines. Then it stared out through the oculus, clearly seeing no threat in Tyrus or his weapons. He used the moment to study the joints in the carapace and looking for weakness or damage. The tyrannid was watching the pieces of metal that had lifted from the floor drifting higher as the ship's gravity plates failed. Tyrus realized that was his answer. Its carapace looked no different than those he had seen on smaller specimens. If he could make it to its neck, his chainsword would be able to cut through. And with the gravity failing fast, he could scale the creature with some speed. A few well-placed bolt rounds should buy him time as he needed to climb the legs. He crouched and rolled his shoulders. The tyrannid snapped its head around and stared at him. There was a look of derision in its eyes. It was unmistakable. The emotion was so clear and familiar that it distracted him. It was a hesitation of less than a second, but it was enough. The tyrannid moved with shocking speed, lunging forward and thrusting a claw at him. Tyrus leapt backwards, parrying with his chainsword, but he was only partly successful. He hacked through the monster's claw, avoiding decapitation, but the broken talons still sliced through a mouth grill of his helmet, impaling part of his jaw. Tyrus pulled free and rolled clear, blood gushing from his helmet. The data feed from his armor died, and as his faceplate collapsed, he tore the helmet off, spilling blood and teeth down his chest. Pain suppressors numbed his face, and he could already feel scar tissue starting to form. His body had been bred to protect itself. The monster circled him. Tyrus, reaching up, touched his face and did the best to shove his broken jaw back into place. His secondary heart was laboring in support of his first, and his vision blurred, but his plan could still work. He threw a feint, lunging towards the open door, and the monster fell for the ruse. Shifting in that direction to block his escape, Tyrus sidestepped in an opposite direction on open fire, launching a volley of shots and at an unarmored area behind the tyrannid's knee. It stumbled, surprised, and lashed out with its tail, but it misjudged the situation. It expected Tyrus to back away, but he sprinted forwards instead, ducking below. The tyrannid screamed. The sound was so loud Tyrus felt like he had been shot through the temples, but he ran on, leaping at the monster, bringing his chainsword down through the carapace that protected its thigh. It grasped at him, trying to envelop him with a spider-like claw, but he wrenched the chainsword free and leapt higher, reaching the tyrannid's exposed ribs. The tyrannid screamed again, but as it tried to fling him off, he lashed out with his chainsword, cutting the teeth cut through the monster's claw, whirring and grinding, shedding sparks of blood and of the color of pitch. The blood hissed as it hit the floor, the metal bubbling. Tyrus triggered a gland in the wall of his mouth, leapt again, and spat into the tyrannid's face. It staggered backward as his acid burned into its jaw, melting the rigid plates around its mouth. Tyrus clambered onto its shoulder and drew back his chainsword. The teeth screamed as he brought down the weapon towards the monster's neck. There was a tearing, cracking sound, and blood filled the air. It took Tyrus a moment to realize that the blood was red. Suddenly, He was no longer on the monster's shoulder. It was holding him at arm's length, and he was neatly skewered on one of the talons. Even bioengineered wonders of Tyrus's body could not endure such trauma. The talon had punctured both his hearts and emerged between his shoulder blades. Massive blood loss robbed him of strength, and his weapon fell from his grip, clattering to the floor dozens of feet below. The Tyranid held him there for a while, studying him, bringing it to its face so close that he could see drool sliding down its teeth. He tried to respond, but his strength was almost gone. To his relief, the Tyranid brought him closer to its crowded mouth, stretching its jaws wide. It would soon be over. Only when he was inches away did Tyrus play his last card, triggering the grenade in his belt. "You will not have my ship," he thought, before an explosion ripped through both of them. Voltus paused halfway across the gunnery deck as the explosion echoed through the ship. More klaxons began howling, and the deeper, rumbling sound rose up from beneath his feet. He had never heard such a sound on a warship before. Even in the heat of battle, it sounded more like an earthquake than a boarding action. He blinked a wall of data across his helm display, analyzing the state of the ship. The Incorruptible was lost. He saw it as soon as the glyphs began scrolling down across his vision. The Xenos had only attacked in a small number, but they had been unusually focused, advancing with incredible speed and destabilizing the ship's superstructure. That was the tremor he could feel through his boots. The ship was collapsing. "It made no sense," he said, talking to the specimen he had captured as if it could understand him. "Everything will be destroyed. There will be nothing left to feed on." He lifted the canister up and stared at its contents. He guessed, by the way it had been attached to one of the larger creatures, that it was probably a parasite. He thought back to how the other Tyranids had responded when he drilled into the specimen. "What are you?" Another tremor rocked the ship, and he saw that there were minutes at most before the Incorruptible came apart. It was a staggering loss, not just the ancient priceless warship, but also the ultramarines it carried. An hour ago, this turn of events would have seemed impossible. He had to get the parasite off the ship. He had never seen anything like it. He had to get it back to the laboratorium and study it properly. It could be the key to understanding the Tyranid's aberrant behavior. "Lieutenant Tyrus," he voxed, raising his voice over the howl of the feedback. "This is Brother Apocryphy Voltus. I am heading to the embarkation deck Hyperia. I mean to board one of the launches and set a course to Regium. There will be enough fuel if I only use it for the course corrections. If you can hear me, meet me there. The Incorruptible is lost. I repeat, the Incorruptible is lost." He changed his helm display, blinking the ship's schematics into view. Zooming in on a deck where he was standing, he could reach the launches in minutes. He continued across the gunnery deck, heading for the exit. He had almost reached the doors when he heard gunfire, a mixture of las guns and auto weapons. He raised his pistol and hurried to the doors, but what he saw in the passageway surprised him. There were no Tyranids in the core, just humans, a mixture of ratings and voidsmen. But they were fighting savagely, attacking each other. There were corpses sprawled across the floor, and the fighting was frenzied and illogical. They seemed to have lost their minds, leaping at each other and fighting so wildly that some of them had abandoned their weapons, scratching and biting like animals. "Hold!" he cried, amplifying his voice through the mouth of his grill of his helmet. There was no response. None of them even seemed to hear him. But then, when he took a step forward, they became even more deranged, screaming and leaping at each other. Some of them looked towards him in terror, but he quickly realized they were not looking at him. They were looking at the creature hanging from his belt. He called out again, but they were beyond his help, and he was running out of time. He marched on, leading them there to fight, heading towards the embarkation deck. The deck was oddly quiet compared to the rest of the ship. There were dozens of Tyranids scattered around the launches, but they were all dead, torn apart with such savagery that Voltus was reminded of the crew back in the passageway. There was something strange happening. Had these Tyranids been affected by the same madness that had overcome the crew? But then, as he clambered over the remains, he saw a real cause. There was a patch of blue powder blue power armor just visible beneath the piles of dead Xenos. The ship lurched again, shaking with such force that the metal rained down on Voltus, knocking him to his knees. Warnings chimed in his helmet as his suit warned him that deck was depressurizing. He was almost out of time. He clambered to his feet and stumbled through the falling debris, kneeling next to the dead Ultramarine, wondering if he might have time to harvest the warrior's priceless gene seed. As he pulled the carcass aside, he saw a tally marks scored into the Ultramarine's pauldron and felt a rush of grief. Baraka, he muttered, grasping the warrior's lifeless hand. He shook his hand tightly around his. Voltus laughed. Ha ha, you cheat death once again, brother. Another mark for your tally. He dragged Braca from the mound of dead and hauled him towards the nearest launch, reciting battle oaths as the Incorruptible began cracking apart, groaning and howling, dissolving into the void. Thanks, guys, for tuning in to this episode of Uncle Grimm's, where I paint things and read things. If you guys want to find out what happens to the Deathleaper, how it turns out, tune in next time for Chapter 4, where we finish off painting on the Deathleaper. If you arrived at this video, you might want to check out one of these videos in order to catch up. So, first and second chapter. Other than that, enjoy the times, and for the Emperor.